Can I invite you to follow while I read Mark 14, verses 53 through to Mark 15, verse 15. 14:53. They took Jesus to the high priests, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the teachers of the law came together. Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. There he sat with the guards and warmed himself at the fire. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so they could put him to death. But they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. Then some stood up and gave this false testimony against him. We heard him say, "I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days will build another not made with hands." Yet even then the testimony did not agree. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus, "and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest tore his clothes. "Why do we need any more witnesses?" he asked. "You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" They all condemned him as worthy of death. Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, "Prophesy." And the guards took him and beat him. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. "You also were with the Nazarene Jesus," she said, but he denied it. "I don't know or understand what you are talking about," he said, and went out into the entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, "This fellow is one of them." Again he denied it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, "Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." He began to call down curses, and he swore at them, "I don't know what this man you're talking about." Immediately the rooster crowed a second time. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times." And he broke down and wept. Very early in the morning, the chief priests, with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. So they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "You have said so," Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things. So again, Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of." But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. Now, it was the custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. "Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate, knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. "What shall I do then with the one you call the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked them. "Crucify him," they shouted. "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. This is the word of the Lord.
The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that's the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him and then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country. And they forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right, one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So you are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days? Come down from the cross and save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross that we might see and believe." Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And at 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing near heard this, they said, "Listen, he's calling Elijah." Someone ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down," he said. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." This is the word of the Lord. Well, we're into the final hours of Jesus' life. The whole story has led to this day, this moment. And in less than 24 hours, Jesus will be dead. Now, in these 5 scenes that play out, if we were there watching all of this happen, there would be nothing to conclude except to say that Jesus' life has ended tragically. This has been a tragic end to the Jesus story. If we looked at what was happening, there would be nothing about it that would indicate anything other than tragedy. And yet, somehow, towards the end of that Friday, after the climactic moment of Jesus' death, somebody who was there saw it differently. Did you see it in verse 39 of chapter 15? When the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." The centurion, of all people, this Roman soldier, the lead Roman soldier who orchestrated and oversaw the whole crucifixion process. A man who was probably hardened, who'd seen hundreds of crucifixions, maybe thousands of deaths in battle. He saw something in the way Jesus died that he had never seen before. And his conclusion as he watched it was that this man must be the Son of God. Now, no one else in Mark's gospel has seen that. No one has seen beyond the fact that Jesus might be a Messiah figure, but here this man saw something even more. So what did he see? What was it that the centurion saw? Well, let's have a look at what Mark wants us to see in these final moments. And I think if we're able to see what Jesus went through and what happened as he died, with this in mind, we will be able to live differently, to suffer differently, and to worship differently. So let's look at the 3 pictures of how Jesus died that Mark shows us. Firstly, Mark shows us an innocent man who is innocent in the face of false accusations. Now, we left off last week with Jesus arrested in the garden by that armed mob. If you missed it, by the way, go and check it out on YouTube. Conrad preached a powerful and important sermon on that section. The mob had been sent by the religious leaders who had finally gotten access to Jesus through Judas. They'd wanted to arrest him for months, and they finally had their opportunity as Judas hands him over to them. And in the panic that follows, all of Jesus' disciples, all of his followers, deserted him and left him alone. And let's pick up the story then in verse 53 of chapter 14. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the teachers of the law came together. Now, you must understand, it's very late on Thursday night, after midnight. And that poses a problem. They've arrested Jesus, but now what do they do with him? Right? The courts aren't exactly open. It's not office hours. So they have to convene an emergency meeting of the Sanhedrin in the home of the high priest. Now, the Sanhedrin was the Jewish ruling body made up of 70 key individuals, priests and elders and scribes. The high priest was the chairperson. And they have this emergency meeting in the middle of the night in order to try and deal with the Jesus problem. The Sanhedrin were permitted by Rome to make certain rulings about certain criminal activities or religious activities. So here they are. They're meeting in this sort of strange environment. And the big question for them now is, how are they going to secure a guilty verdict? What is Jesus actually going to be convicted of? Right? Because even though it's a bit of a kangaroo court, they do have processes. They can't just find him guilty for no reason. Problem is, as they try to find evidence, there is none. And of course there's none, because this is Jesus. And the Bible tells us that Jesus lived a perfect life, that he never did anything wrong. He never sinned, even once, not as a kid, not as an adult or a teenager or any moment in between. He was without sin. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine meeting somebody like that? No character flaws, no sort of chance that they will say something hurtful or unkind or untrue, no kind of selfish agenda. Jesus was perfect in every way. And so to find evidence that would condemn him to death is impossible. So they have to make up stuff, and this is what they try and do. But it doesn't go as smoothly as they'd hoped. Verse 56 says that the false witnesses they try to bring together couldn't even get their stories to match up. The one accusation that looks like it might have some traction has to do with the temple. Someone comes forward and says, I think he said he was going to destroy the temple. Now, that's a huge accusation. If he's found guilty of that, that's terrorism, right? That's a big deal. But actually, Jesus didn't say he was going to destroy the temple at any point. Do you remember back in Mark 13, he did say the temple's going to be destroyed, but he didn't say, I'm going to destroy it. And so that falls flat. So they try other angles, false accusation after false accusation. The whole time, did you notice, Jesus is just remaining silent. Look at verse 60 with me. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. I mean, it's a fair question. Aren't you going to defend yourself? I mean, if you know you're innocent, surely you should say something at this point. Now the frustration is building. They've got nothing. And then the high priest sort of hits on an idea, and he thinks, well, perhaps if I can't find evidence to find Jesus guilty, maybe I can make Jesus incriminate himself by asking him a really dynamite question that'll cause an explosion. And so that's what he does. He gets to the real heart of who Jesus thinks he is. Have a look with me in verse 61. Again, the high priest asked him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? In other words, the Son of God. Now that's an explosive question. Because if you claim to be a rival king, a Messiah, or even more, if you claim to be God's own son, well, that better be true or you're going to be dead. And of course, Mark's whole story is written to show us that this is exactly who Jesus is. From the very first verse, Mark said, I'm telling you all of this because I want to show you that Jesus is, one, the Messiah, and two, the Son of God. And along the way, Jesus has demonstrated it. He hasn't come out and said it because he's wanted to keep a low profile for the sake of prolonging his ministry. But now, the time has come. And so now he owns it, and this is the clearest that he is in the whole story so far, and he comes out and says it in verse 61, are you the Messiah? Are you the Son of the Blessed One? I am, Jesus said. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. I mean, it's not enough that Jesus says, I am. He then almost throws more fuel onto the fire of accusations, because what he does is he claims to be a Son of Man riding on the clouds of heaven and seated at the right hand of God. Now, where does he get all this from? Well, it's critically important that we understand where Jesus gets these ideas, Son of Man riding on the clouds, right hand of God. What he's doing is he's bringing together two critically important Old Testament passages that the high priest and everybody else there would have known. The first one is Daniel chapter 7, written 600 years earlier. Daniel has this vision of a human being, a son of man, that's what the phrase means, a human being riding on the clouds. I mean, has anybody ever done that? Riding on the clouds and into the very presence of God. And when he gets there, this Son of Man is given universal rule and authority to judge the whole earth. Do you see what Jesus is saying to these people judging him? And then he grabs Psalm 110, which is about David seeing a human being who he calls his Lord, and he calls him his Lord because he is seated at God's right hand. In other words, he's God's right-hand man. And in Psalm 110, this person seated there is also given the job of judging all of God's enemies. So do you see what Jesus is saying here? See, who is judging who here in the scene? Jesus says, you ask me if I'm the Messiah? You don't know the half of it. You think that you're judging me, that I'm on trial? I am the judge of all the earth. That's what he's saying. Now, the reaction is immediate and explosive. The high priest, we're told, verse 63, the high priest tore his clothes. Why do we need any more witnesses? He says, you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? It is blasphemous, of course, if it's not true. It's absolutely blasphemous to claim to be this world-ruling judge of all the earth. And so the trial comes to an abrupt end. In fact, it turns into a bit of a riot. Look at how it continues, verse 64. They all condemned him as worthy of death. Then some began to spit on him. They blindfolded him. They struck him with their fists. And they said, prophesy. I mean, isn't that funny? He's just been doing that. He's just been prophesying, saying who he really is. And the guards took him and beat him. We're supposed to see this ridiculous, ironic paradox happening here. Everything has been turned upside down. The innocent one, who is actually the judge of the whole earth, is being judged by those who are guilty of the greatest crime in all of history. And of course, we still have everything turned on its head in our world today. The world still thinks it can sit in judgment over Jesus, that it can demand that Jesus answers to us and proves himself to us. Sometimes Christians have a feeling that they need to somehow defend Jesus too, don't we? Oh, well, what if people think badly of him? What if they lie about him? And we jump to Jesus' defense as if he needs anyone to defend him. This is the judge of all the earth, please. He doesn't need anybody to stand up for him. And of course, we're guilty as well, sometimes ourselves, of putting Jesus on trial as well. When things happen to us in our lives that we don't understand what he's doing, we almost accuse him, don't we? We accuse him of getting it wrong. Or we think, if he doesn't answer and explain himself, then I might even leave this thing. Who do we think we are? This is the judge of all the earth that is on trial here before the Sanhedrin. Jesus doesn't need to prove anything. He is the only innocent one, and one day we will have to answer to him. So maybe that's what the centurion saw as Jesus died. But secondly, Jesus, we're told here, dies as one condemned in place of the guilty, in place of guilty sinners. While all of this is going on upstairs, Mark diverts our attention to what is happening in the courtyard below. Peter, it turns out, has actually followed Jesus secretively, keeping a low profile. And so there he is in the courtyard, and he joins a group huddled around a fire. And while the greatest trial in all of history is happening upstairs, well, Peter is going through a bit of a trial of his own. Did you notice? Verse 66. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. And when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked at him closely. You were with that Nazarene Jesus, she said. But he denied it. Peter's being accused himself. But he's denying it. In fact, Jesus said this whole thing would happen, didn't he? He said, you're going to deny me 3 times. Peter said, there's no way I'll do that. First time it happens in verse 68. Second time in verse 70. And then in verse 71, look at it. Peter began to call down curses, and he swore to them, I don't know this man you're talking about. And immediately the cock crowed the second time, and Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him. Does it get more guilty than denying and turning your back on the Savior of the world? I mean, how must Peter have felt as he bore that kind of guilt? How does somebody like Peter deal with that sort of guilt? I mean, maybe that's a question you've asked. Perhaps there's guilt that you're carrying yourself, ways in which you've blown it, and there are things that you still bear today that that you cannot get away from. You cannot get out from under them. You feel the weight of guilt that can't be taken away. And the question is, how do you take it away? Well, let's keep reading. Back upstairs, the Sanhedrin has reached their decision, and the decision is Jesus has to die. Now, the problem with that for them is that they're not actually allowed as a Jewish ruling body to pass the death sentence. Only Rome can do that, right? Because they're under the Roman Empire, so a capital offense has to be, the sentencing has to be done by Rome. And so they realize they're going to have to present Jesus to Pilate, who is the Roman governor of Judea. So chapter 15, verse 1. Very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. So they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Now, Pilate he's kind of like a premier, I suppose, in our language. He's the Roman authority in Judea. And I've often wondered, how did Pilate see this day going as he woke up in the morning, as he had his cornflakes for breakfast, as he thought about the day ahead? Maybe I'll do some admin today. Maybe I'll check on a project or two, stop by the gym on the way home. He didn't realize, of course, that he was about to pass the greatest judgment in all of history. So that 2,000 years later, we would still say in our creeds that Jesus suffered under this man, Pontius Pilate. Now, Pilate wasn't exactly sympathetic to Jewish people. He thought them a bit of a nuisance at times, but he also doesn't want any trouble in his region. And so when the Sanhedrin bring Jesus to him, he gives them the time of day. He listens to their case. Now, the Sanhedrin are clever. They don't present Jesus on a religious charge to Pilate because they know Pilate doesn't care about blasphemy. That's not an issue for him. No, instead, they twist it slightly and they present a political charge. They say, this man claims to be a rival king. Have a look at verse 2. Are you the king of the Jews? Pilate asked. You've said so, Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things. And so again, Pilate asked him, aren't you going to answer? See how many things they're accusing you of. But still, Jesus made no reply. Just like before, Jesus again is silent. It's strange, isn't it? Why doesn't he speak up? He's basically accepting the guilty verdict by not speaking up. And that's exactly what he's doing. Not because he's guilty, but because he's come for the guilty. And he is standing in place of the guilty. Centuries earlier, the prophet Isaiah had predicted just such a moment in Isaiah chapter 53, where he said this. He said, looking ahead to this person who would come, he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. Jesus, in his silence, is accepting the guilty verdict, not because he's guilty, but because we're guilty. He willingly accepts the abuse and the accusations and the punishment and the condemnation that we deserved, so that he might be able to secure our release. Now, the thing about Pilate, of course, is he is not stupid. He sees straight through the religious leaders' accusations. He knows they have nothing on Jesus. And so he tries throughout this whole process to set Jesus free. And the harder he tries, the harder the religious leaders try to rile up the crowd to make sure that he doesn't get set free. Pilate's trying to get this thing thrown out of court. He thinks perhaps he has one last trick up his sleeve. It is Passover time, after all, and there is a custom at Passover that the Roman Empire would release a prisoner to the Jewish people as a sort of a sign of goodwill. Let's read from verse 7. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who'd committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? Pilate asked, knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to get Pilate to release Barabbas instead. What shall I do then with the one that you call the king of the Jews? Pilate asked them. Crucify him, they shouted. Pilate buckles, the crowd wins, Barabbas is freed, and Jesus is condemned. Now, can you see what is happening here? Jesus, the innocent one, changes place with an evil man. That's exactly what Jesus has come to do in his death. He will be condemned so that the guilty can go free. People like Barabbas, people like Peter, people like us. And that is, friends, how you can be so guilty like Peter and Barabbas and us, with the weight of all the things we've done wrong, and still somehow have a fresh start, a clean slate. How is it that you can start again and move beyond all that guilt? The only way is by getting that guilt dealt with. And the only way that can happen, of course, is through the cross. There's no other way to deal with guilt. He was pierced for our transgressions, Isaiah says. Maybe the soldier, the centurion, saw that as he saw Jesus die. Thirdly, Jesus experienced God's judgment instead of God's enemies. Pilate has Jesus flogged and he hands him over to the soldiers to be crucified. Now, flogging was a brutal thing. It was a violent thing. It usually involved stripping the person right down, tying them to a stake, and then whipping them with a specially made whip, leather ropes with pieces of broken bone or glass at the end. The person's body was literally torn apart, and there was no limit to the number of beatings. Very often, the perpetrator or the victim was dead before the crucifixion even happened. But it's worth noting that Mark actually doesn't mention any of those gory details, which would have been kind of worth mentioning, don't you think? In fact, very little about Jesus' physical suffering is mentioned at all. And the reason is that the physical suffering that Jesus endured, and it was a horrific ordeal, was nothing compared to the suffering at an unseen level. Because Jesus' death was not about being condemned by a human court, it was about being condemned under God's judgment. So let's skip ahead, past the mocking coronation that the soldiers perform, past the brutal carrying of that cross. Can you imagine? Let's pick it up in verse 25. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right, one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So you're going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days? Come down from the cross and save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross that we may see and believe." And those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. At noon, this is interesting, at noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. Darkness in the middle of the day for 3 hours. This is not some sort of storm that descended on that hill outside Jerusalem. This is not a solar eclipse. Right? There's no way a solar eclipse would last for 3 hours. And anyway, you can't have a solar eclipse, I'm told, if it's full moon. No, this is a supernatural event. In fact, all the main events of Jesus' death happen in the darkness. Have you noticed that? The arrest and betrayal in the garden, the trial in the middle of the night, and now at the moment of Jesus' death, total darkness over the whole land. Why? Well, in the rest of the Bible, darkness in the daytime is a picture of God's judgment being poured out. And at Passover time, this would have been fresh in people's minds because they would have remembered that 9th plague in Egypt when God brought total darkness on the land of Egypt. There's nothing worse than darkness. I mean, we can go without light for a while, but total darkness, that 9th plague was horrific. Just before that final plague when the firstborn in Egypt were killed in that Passover judgment. The Old Testament prophets often spoke about God's judgment in these terms. Just listen, for example, to Isaiah 13, verse 9. "See, the day of the Lord is coming, a cruel day with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land desolate and destroy the sinners within it. What will it be like? The stars of heaven and their constellations will not show their light. The rising sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light. I will punish the world for its evil, the wicked for their sins." When you see darkness in the daytime, midday, you should be thinking of God's judgment being poured out. Except who is God angry with in this scene? Where is his judgment being directed? It's not on those who put Jesus on the cross, the religious leaders, the soldiers, Pilate, Peter, the crowd who are watching. No, in that moment of his death, God pours his righteous judgment out on his Son instead of us. Not because he deserved it, but because we deserved it. Verse 34. At 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, these might be some of the most profound words in the whole Bible, the most disturbing words in the Bible. This is what it cost Jesus to bear the judgment that we deserved. This is where the ultimate suffering is. Jesus forsaken by his Father. Now, of course, we don't have the faintest idea what that must mean, what was involved in somehow Father and Son being separated in that moment. But Mark wants us to realize that as God's judgment fell, that's what happened. Their relationship was severed for that moment, as the Father's love was cut off from his Son, so that it never has to be cut off from us. That's why darkness fell in that moment. You see, when somebody that you don't know very well rejects you or turns away from you, it's not so bad. I mean, if you are here for the first time, this is not to offend you. I'm so glad you're here. But if you tell me after the service, I'm not coming back, well, I'll be sad. I'll probably follow up. But after a while, I'll get over it. If it's somebody who's been here for 20 years and I've gotten to know them and they're close and they're family and they tell me they're leaving, it's devastating. If my wife tells me she's leaving, I mean, nothing compares to that, right? Because the longer you know somebody and the deeper you love somebody, the greater the pain of separation. So can you imagine what it must have meant for that eternal bond of love between Father and Son to be broken in that moment? My God, why have you forsaken me? What sort of agony must be involved? What sort of love for us must be involved for Jesus to endure that? He bore God's judgment for our guilt so that we never have to bear it. The righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. You see, he could not save himself and save us. That wasn't an option. How Jesus must love us. And how evil sin must be. I mean, when we go lightly with evil, when we go lightly with our sin, just stop and think about this. That Jesus bore the agony of separation from his Father for your sin. It was my sin that held him there, we sing. And how can we ever think that there is any other way to God? I mean, if there was any other way, Jesus said in the garden, please take this cup if there's any other way. But there wasn't. What a blasphemy to think that we can get to God some other way. I know sometimes we like to think that perhaps, the other religions will find their way to God. Look at Jesus on the cross. Do you think it's possible? Why would Jesus go to the cross and endure what he endured if there was another way? There was no other way. But in that moment, the judgment of God was diverted away from us if we will trust in him. Now, did it work? Did it actually work? Well, I want us just, as we close, to notice one other little scene. I said there were 5 scenes. There's actually a 6th one snuck in there in verse 38. Because in verse 38, it's very strange. We're at the foot of the cross. We're watching the agony of what's unfolding. But in that moment of Jesus' death, we're taken to the other side of the city. We're taken to the temple in Jerusalem. We're taken into the very holy place, the very central room where God symbolically met with his people. And as you arrived at that most holy place, there was a big, thick curtain. Huge thing. And it was there for a very important reason, because it separated ordinary people from the presence of God. There was no way that you could get beyond that curtain and survive, because sinners cannot come into the presence of a holy God. Only the high priest once a year could do that. But in the moment of Jesus' death, look at verse 37. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. That big no entry sign was removed, and access was now granted into the presence of God. My guilt paid for, the barrier gone. Is that not incredible? Is that not stunning that Jesus would do that for us? And so when the centurion, verse 39 says, when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. Do you see it? Let's pray.